to get some advice from the town clerk, she said. To these poor people, the town clerk was what the Delphic oracle was to the ancient Greeks. By giving him a reel and a cigar, she continued, he'll tell you all the laws so that your head bursts listening to him. If you have a peso, he'll save you, even though you may be at the foot of the scaffold. When my friend Simon was put in jail and flogged for not being able to give evidence about a robbery perpetrated near his house, Abba, for 2.5 reals and a string of garlics, the town clerk got him out. And I saw Simon myself when 292 he could scarcely walk and he had to stay in bed at least a month. His flesh rotted as a result and he died. Sister Bali's advice was accepted and she herself volunteered to interview the town clerk. Julie gave her 4 reals and added some strips of jerked venison her grandfather had got, for Tandang Selo had again devoted himself to hunting. But the town clerk could do nothing. The prisoner was in Manila, and his power did not extend that far. If at least he were at the capital, then he ventured to make a show of his authority, which he knew very well did not extend beyond the boundaries of Tiani, but he had to maintain his prestige and keep the jerked venison. But I can give you a good piece of advice, and it is that you go with Julie to see the justice of the peace. But it's very necessary that Julie go. The justice of the peace was a very rough fellow, but if he should see Julie he might conduct himself less rudely. This is wherein lay the wisdom of the advice. With great gravity the Honorable Justice listened to Sister Bali, who did the talking. But not without staring from time to time at the girl, who hung her head with shame. People would say that she was greatly interested in Basilio, people who did not remember her debt of gratitude, nor that his imprisonment, according to report, was on her account. After belching 3 or 4 times, for his honor had that ugly habit, he said that the only person who could save Basilio was Padre Camorra, in case he should care to do so. Here he stared meaningly at the girl and advised her to deal with the curate in person. You know what influence he has. He got your grandfather out of jail. A report from him is enough to deport a newborn babe or save from death a man with the noose about his neck. Julie said nothing, but Sister Bali took this advice as though she had read it in a novena, and was ready to accompany the girl to the convento. It so happened that 293 she was just going there to get as alms a scapulary in exchange for 4 full reals. But Julie shook her head and was unwilling to go to the convento. Sister Bali thought she could guess the reason. Padre Camorra was reputed to be very fond of the women, and was very frolicsome, so she tried to reassure her. You've nothing to fear if I go with you. Haven't you read in the booklet Tandang Baggio, given you by the curate, that the girls should go to the convento, even without the knowledge of their elders, to relate what is going on at home? Abba, that book is printed with the permission of the Archbishop. Julie became impatient and wished to cut short such talk, so she begged the pious woman to go if she wished, but his honor observed with a belch that the supplications of a youthful face were more moving than those of an old one. The sky poured its dew over the fresh flowers in greater abundance than over the withered ones. The metaphor was fiendishly beautiful. Julie did not reply and the two left the house. In the street the girl firmly refused to go to the convento and they returned to their village. Sister Bali, who felt offended at this lack of confidence in herself, on the way home relieved her feelings by administering a long preachment to the girl. The truth was that the girl could not take that step without damning herself in her own eyes, besides being cursed of men and cursed of God. It had been intimated to her several times, whether with reason or not, that if she would make that sacrifice, her father would be pardoned, and yet she had refused, in spite of the cries of her conscience reminding her of her filial duty. Now must she make it for Basilio, Her sweetheart. That would be to fall to the sound of mockery and laughter from all creation. Basilio himself would despise her. No, never. She would first hang herself or leap from some precipice. At any rate, she was already damned for being a wicked daughter. The poor girl had besides to endure all the reproaches 294 of her relatives, who, knowing nothing of what had passed between her and Padre Camorra, laughed at her fears. Would Padre Camorra fix his attention upon a country girl when there were so many others in the town? Hero the good women cited names of unmarried girls, rich and beautiful, who had been more or less unfortunate. Meanwhile, if they should shoot Basilio, Julie covered her ears and stared wildly about, as if seeking a voice that might plead for her, but she saw only her grandfather, who was dumb and had his gaze fixed on his hunting spear. That night she scarcely slept at all. Dreams and nightmares, some funereal, some bloody, danced before her sight and woke her often, bathed in cold perspiration. She fancied that she heard shots, she imagined that she saw her father, that father who had done so much for her, fighting in the forests, hunted like a wild beast because she had refused to save him. The figure of her father was transformed and she recognized Basilio, dying, with looks of reproach at her. The wretched girl arose, prayed, wept, called upon her mother, upon death, and there was even a moment when, overcome with terror, if it had not been night time, she would have run straight to the convento, let happen what would. With the coming of day the sad presentiments and the terrors of darkness were partly dissipated. The light inspired hopes in her. But the news of the afternoon was terrible. For there was talk of persons shot, so the next night was for the girl frightful. In her desperation she decided to give herself up as soon as day dawned and then kill herself afterwards, anything, rather than endure such tortures. But the dawn brought new hope and she would not go to church or even leave the house. She was afraid she would yield. So passed several days in praying and cursing, in calling upon God and wishing for death. The day gave her a slight respite and she trusted in some miracle. The reports that 295 came from Manila, although they reached there magnified, said that of the prisoners, some had secured their liberty, thanks to patrons and influence. Someone had to be sacrificed. Who would it be? Julie shuddered and returned home biting her fingernails. Then came the night with its terrors, which took on double proportions and seemed to be converted into realities. Julie feared to fall asleep, for her slumbers were a continuous nightmare. Looks of reproach would flash across her eyelids just as soon as they were closed, complaints and laments pierced her ears. She saw her father wandering about hungry, without rest or repose. She saw Basilio dying in the road, pierced by 2 bullets, just as she had seen the corpse of that neighbor who had been killed while in the charge of the civil guard. She saw the bonds that cut into the flesh. She saw the blood pouring from the mouth. She heard Basilio calling to her, "Save me! Save me! You alone can save me!" Then a burst of laughter would resound and she would turn her eyes to see her father gazing at her with eyes full of reproach. Julie would wake up, sit up on her petade, and draw her hands across her forehead to arrange her hair. Cold sweat, like the sweat of death, moistened it. "Mother, mother," she sobbed. Meanwhile, they who were so carelessly disposing of people's fates, he who commanded the legal murders, he who violated justice and made use of the law to maintain himself by force, slept in peace. At last a traveler arrived from Manila and reported that all the prisoners had been set free, all except Basilio, who had no protector. It was reported in Manila, added the traveler, that the young man would be deported to the Carolines, having been forced to sign a petition beforehand, in which he declared that he asked it voluntarily. 3 The 296 traveler had seen the very steamer that was going to take him away. This report put an end to all the girl's hesitation. Besides, her mind was already quite weak from so many nights of watching and horrible dreams. Pale and with unsteady eyes, she sought out Sister Bali and, in a voice that was cause for alarm, told her that she was ready, asking her to accompany her. Sister Bali thereupon rejoiced and tried to soothe her, but Julie paid no attention to her, apparently intent only upon hurrying to the convento. She had decked herself out in her finest clothes, and even pretended to be quite gay, talking a great deal, although in a rather incoherent way. So they set out. Julie went ahead, becoming impatient that her companion lagged behind. But as they neared the town, her nervous energy began gradually to abate. She fell silent and wavered in her resolution, lessened her pace and soon dropped behind, so that Sister Bali had to encourage her. "We'll get there late," she remonstrated. Julie now followed, pale, with downcast eyes, which she was afraid to raise. She felt that the whole world was staring at her and pointing its finger at her. A vile name whistled in her ears, but still she disregarded it and continued on her way. Nevertheless, when they came in sight of the convento, she stopped and began to tremble. "Let's go home, she begged, holding her companion back. Sister Bali had to take her by the arm and half drag her along, reassuring her and telling her about the books of the friars. She would not desert her, so there was nothing to fear. Padre Camorra had other things in mind. Julie was only a poor country girl. But upon arriving at the door of the convento, Julie firmly refused to go in, catching hold of the wall. "No, no," she pleaded in terror. "No, no, no. Have pity." 297. But what a fool. Sister Bali pushed her gently along, Julie, pallid and with wild features, offering resistance. The expression of her face said that she saw death before her. "All right, let's go back, if you don't want to," at length the good woman exclaimed. In irritation, as she did not believe there was any real danger. Padre Camorra, in spite of all his reputation, would dare do nothing before her. Let them carry poor Basilio into exile, let them shoot him on the way, saying that he tried to escape, she added. When he's dead, then remorse will come. But as for myself, I owe him no favors, so he can't reproach me. That was the decisive stroke. In the face of that reproach, with wrath and desperation mingled, like one who rushes to suicide, Julie closed her eyes in order not to see the abyss into which she was hurling herself and resolutely entered the convento. A sigh that sounded like the rattle of death escaped from her lips. Sister Bali followed, telling her how to act. That night comments were mysteriously whispered about certain events which had occurred. That afternoon, a girl had leaped from a window of the convento, falling upon some stones and killing herself. Almost at the same time another woman had rushed out of the convento to run through the streets shouting and screaming like a lunatic. The prudent townsfolk dared not utter any names, and many mothers pinched their daughters for letting slip expressions that might compromise them. Later, very much later, at twilight, an old man came from a village and stood calling at the door of the convento, which was closed and guarded by sacristans. The old man beat the door with his fists and with his head, while he uttered cries stifled and inarticulate, like those of a dumb person, until he was at length driven away by blows and shoves. Then he made his way to the gobernadorcio's house, but was told that The gobernadorcillo was not there. 298 He was at the convento. He went to the justice of the peace, but neither was the justice of the peace at home. He had been summoned to the convento. He went to the tenente mayor, but he too was at the convento. He directed his steps to the barracks, but the lieutenant of the civil guard was at the convento. The old man then returned to his village, weeping like a child. His wails were heard in the middle of the night, causing men to bite their lips and women to clasp their hands, while the dogs slunk fearfully back into the houses with their tails between their legs. "Ah, God, God," said a poor woman, lean from fasting, "in thy presence there is no rich, no poor, no white, no black, thou wilt grant us justice." "Yes," rejoined her husband, "just so that God they preach is not a pure invention, a fraud. They themselves are the first not to believe in him." At 8 o'clock in the evening it was rumored that more than 7 friars, proceeding from neighboring towns, were assembled in the convento to hold a conference. On the following day, Tandangsello disappeared forever from the village, carrying with him his hunting spear. 299. 1. The native priests Burgos, Gomez, and Zamora, charged with complicity in the uprising of 1872, and executed tr upward arrow. 2. This versicle, found in the booklets of prayer, is common on the scapularies, which, during the late insurrection, were easily converted into the anting, or amulets, worn by the fanatics tr upward arrow. 3. This practice secretly compelling suspects to sign a request to be transferred to some other island was by no means a figment of the author's imagination, but was extensively practiced to anticipate any legal difficulties that might arise tr upward arrow. Contents. Chapter XXXI. The High Official. Elispigni etsa, Virtu, Elispigni etsa grandeur. Tout snva, Victor Hugo. The newspapers of Manila were so engrossed in accounts of a notorious murder committed in Europe, in panegyrics and puffs for various preachers in the city, in the constantly increasing success of the French operetta, that they could scarcely devote space to the crimes perpetrated in the provinces by a band of Tulazanes headed by a fierce and terrible leader who was called Matangla in point one. Only when the object of the attack was a convento or a Spaniard there then appeared long articles giving frightful details and asking for martial law, energetic measures, and so on. So it was that they could take no notice of what had occurred in the town of Tiani, nor was there the slightest hint or allusion to it. In private circles something was whispered, but so confused, so vague, and so little consistent, that not even the name of the victim was known, while those who showed the greatest interest forgot it quickly, trusting that the affair had been settled in some way with the wronged family. The only one who knew anything certain was Padre Camorra, who had to leave the town, to be transferred to another or to remain for some time in the convento. In Manila. "Poor Padre Camorra," exclaimed Benzabe in a fit of generosity. "He was so jolly, and had such a good heart." It was true that the students had recovered their liberty, 300 thanks to the exertions of their relatives, who did not hesitate at expense, gifts, or any sacrifice whatsoever. The first to see himself free, as was to be expected, was Macarig, and the last Isagani, because Padre Florentine did not reach Manila until a week after the events. So many acts of clemency secured for the general the title of clement and merciful, which Benzabe hastened to add to his long list of adjectives. The only one who did not obtain his liberty was Basilio, since he was also accused of having in his possession prohibited books. We don't know whether this referred to his textbook on legal medicine or to the pamphlets that were found, dealing with the Philippines, or both together. The fact is that it was said that prohibited literature was being secretly sold, and upon the unfortunate boy fell all the weight of the rod of justice. It was reported that His Excellency had been thus advised: "It's necessary that there be someone, so that the prestige of authority may be sustained and that it may not be said that we made a great fuss over nothing. Authority before everything. It's necessary that someone be made an example of. Let there be just one who, according to Padre Irene, was the servant of Capitan Tiago. There'll be no one to enter a complaint. Servant and student, asked His Excellency. That fellow, then. Let it be he. Your Excellency will pardon me, observed the high official, who happened to be present. But I've been told that this boy is a medical student and his teachers speak well of him. If he remains a prisoner he'll lose a year, and as this year he finishes. The high official's interference in behalf of Basilio, instead of helping, harmed him. For some time there had been between this official and His Excellency strained relations and bad feelings, augmented by frequent clashes. Yes. So much the greater reason that he should be kept prisoner, a year longer in his studies, instead of injuring 301 him, will do good, not only to himself but to all who afterwards fall into his hands. One doesn't become a bad physician by extensive practice. So much the more reason that he should remain. Soon the filibustering reformers will say that we are not looking out for the country, concluded His Excellency with a sarcastic laugh. The high official realized that he had made a false move and took Basilio's case to heart. But it seems to me that this young man is the most innocent of all, he rejoined, rather timidly. Books have been seized in his possession, observed the secretary. Yes, works on medicine and pamphlets written by peninsulars, with the leaves uncut. And besides, what does that signify? Moreover, this young man was not present at the banquet in the Pansiteria, he hasn't mixed up in anything. As I've said, he's the most innocent. So much the better, exclaimed His Excellency jocosely. In that way the punishment will prove more salutary and exemplary, since it inspires greater terror. To govern is to act in this way, my dear sir, as it is often expedient to sacrifice the welfare of one to the welfare of many. But I'm doing more from the welfare of one will result. The welfare of all, the principle of endangered authority is preserved, prestige is respected and maintained. By this act of mine I'm correcting my own and other people's faults. The high official restrained himself with an effort and, disregarding the allusion, decided to take another tack. But doesn't your Excellency fear the responsibility? What have I to fear, rejoined the general impatiently. Haven't I discretionary powers? Can't I do what I please for the better government of these islands? What have I to fear? Can some menial perhaps arraign me before the tribunals and exact from me responsibility? Even though he had the means, he would have to consult the ministry first, and the minister. 302. He waved his hand and burst out into laughter. The minister who appointed me, the devil knows where he is, and he will feel honored in being able to welcome me when I return. The present one, I don't even think of him, and the devil take him too. The one that relieves him will find himself in so many difficulties with his new duties that he won't be able to fool with trifles. I, my dear sir, have nothing over me but my conscience, I act according to my conscience. And my conscience is satisfied, so I don't care a straw for the opinions of this one and that. My conscience, my dear sir, my conscience. Yes, general, but the country. Tut, 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 tut. The country, what have I to do with the country? Have I perhaps contracted any obligations to it? Do I owe my office to it? Was it the country that elected me? A brief pause ensued, during which the high official stood with bowed head. Then, as if reaching a decision, he raised it to stare fixedly at the general. Pale and trembling, he said with repressed energy, "That doesn't matter, General, that doesn't matter at all. Your Excellency has not been chosen by the Filipino people, but by Spain, all the more reason why you should treat the Filipinos well so that they may not be able to reproach Spain. The greater reason, General, the greater reason. Your Excellency, by coming here, has contracted the obligation to govern justly, to seek the welfare." "Am I not doing it?" interrupted His Excellency in exasperation, taking a step forward. "Haven't I told you that I am getting from the good of one the good of all? Are you now going to give me lessons? If you don't understand my actions, how am I to blame? Do I compel you to share my responsibility?" "Certainly not," replied the high official, drawing himself up proudly. "Your Excellency does not compel me, Your Excellency cannot compel me, to share your responsibility. I understand mine in quite another way, 303, and because I have it, I'm going to speak. I've held my peace a long time." "Oh, Your Excellency needn't make those gestures, because the fact that I've come here in this or that capacity doesn't mean that I have given up my rights, that I have been reduced to the part of a slave, without voice or dignity. I don't want Spain to lose this beautiful empire, these 8 millions of patient and submissive subjects, who live on hopes and delusions, but neither do I wish to soil my hands in their barbarous exploitation. I don't wish it ever to be said that, the slave trade abolished, Spain has continued to cloak it with her banner and perfect it under a wealth of specious institutions. No, to be great Spain does not have to be a tyrant. Spain is sufficient unto herself. Spain was greater when she had only her own territory, wrested from the clutches of the Moor. I too am a Spaniard, but before being a Spaniard I am a man, and before Spain and above Spain is her honor. The lofty principles of morality, the eternal principles of immutable justice. Ah! You are surprised that I think thus, because you have no idea of the grandeur of the Spanish name. No, you haven't any idea of it, you identify it with persons and interests. To you the Spaniard may be a pirate, he may be a murderer, a hypocrite, a cheat, anything. Just so he keep what he has, but to me the Spaniard should lose everything, empire, power, wealth, everything, before his honor. Ah, my dear sir, we protest when we read that might is placed before right, yet we applaud when in practice we see might play the hypocrite in not only perverting right but even in using it as a tool in order to gain control. For the very reason that I love Spain, I'm speaking now, and I defy your frown. I don't wish that the coming ages accuse Spain of being the stepmother of the nations, the vampire of races, the tyrant of small islands, since it would be a horrible mockery of the noble principles of our ancient kings. How are we carrying out their sacred legacy? They promised to these 304 islands protection and justice, and we are playing with the lives and liberties of the inhabitants. They promised civilization, and we are curtailing it, fearful that they may aspire to a nobler existence. They promised them light, and we cover their eyes that they may not witness our orgies. They promised to teach them virtue, and we are encouraging their vice. Instead of peace, wealth, and justice, confusion reigns. Commerce languishes, and skepticism is fostered among the masses. Let us put ourselves in the place of the Filipinos and ask ourselves what we would do in their place. Ah, in your silence I read their right to rebel, and if matters do not mend they will rebel some day, and justice will be on their side. With them will go the sympathy of all honest men, of every patriot in the world. When a people is denied light, home, liberty, and justice, things that are essential to life, and therefore man's patrimony, that people has the right to treat him who so despoils it, as we would the robber who intercepts us on the highway. There are no distinctions. There are no exceptions, nothing but a fact, a right, an aggression, and every honest man who does not place himself on the side of the wronged makes himself an accomplice, and stains his conscience. True, I am not a soldier, and the years are cooling the little fire in my blood. But just as I would risk being torn to pieces to defend the integrity of Spain against any foreign invader or against an unjustified disloyalty in her provinces, so I also assure you that I would place myself beside the oppressed Filipinos, because I would prefer to fall in the cause of the outraged rights of humanity to triumphing with the selfish interests of a nation, even when that nation be called as it is called Spain. Do you know when the mail boat leaves? Inquired His Excellency coldly, when the high official had finished speaking. The latter stared at him fixedly, then dropped his head and silently left the palace. 305. Outside he found his carriage awaiting him. Some day when you declare yourselves independent, he said somewhat abstractedly to the native lackey who opened the carriage door. For him, remember that there were not lacking in Spain hearts that beat for you and struggled for your rights. Where, sir? Asked the lackey, who had understood nothing of this and was inquiring whither they should go. 2 hours later the high official handed in his resignation and announced his intention of returning to Spain by the next mail steamer. 306. 1 Hawkeye. TR Upward Arrow. Contents. Chapter XXXII. Effect of the Pasquinades. As a result of the events narrated, many mothers ordered their sons immediately to leave off their studies and devote themselves to idleness or to agriculture. When the examinations came, suspensions were plentiful, and he was a rare exception who finished the course, if he had belonged to the famous association, to which no one paid any more attention. Peck's son, Tadeo, and Juanito Pérez were all alike suspended, the first receiving his dismissal with his foolish grin and declaring his intention of becoming an officer in some court, while Tadeo, with his eternal holiday, realized at last, paid for an illumination and made a bonfire of his books. Nor did the others get off much better, and at length they too had to abandon their studies, to the great satisfaction of their mothers, who always fancy their sons hanged if they should come to understand what the books teach. Juanito Pérez alone took the blow ill, since it forced him to leave school for his father's store, with whom he was thenceforward to be associated in the business. The rascal found the store much less entertaining. But after some time his friends again noticed his hump appear, a symptom that his good humor was returning. The rich Macaraig, in view of the catastrophe, took good care not to expose himself, and having secured a passport by means of money set out in haste for Europe. It was said that His Excellency, the Captain General, in his desire to do good by good means, and careful of the interests of the Filipinos, hindered the departure of everyone who could not first prove substantially that he had the money to spend and could live in idleness in European cities. Among our 307 acquaintances, those who got off best were Isagani and Sandoval, the former passed in the subject he studied under Padre Fernandez and was suspended in the others, while the latter was able to confuse the examining board with his oratory. Basilio was the only one who did not pass in any subject, who was not suspended, and who did not go to Europe, for he remained in Bilibid prison, subjected every 3 days to examinations, almost always the same in principle, without other variation. Then a change of inquisitors, since it seemed that in the presence of such great guilt, all gave up or fell away in horror. And while the documents mouldered or were shifted about, while the stamped papers increased like the plasters of an ignorant physician. On the body of a hypochondriac, Basilio became informed of all the details of what had happened in Tiani, of the death of Julie and the disappearance of Tandang Selo. Sinang, the abused cochero, who had driven him to San Diego, happened to be in Manila at that time and called to give him all the news. Meanwhile, Simão had recovered his health, or so at least the newspapers said. Benzabe rendered thanks to the Omnipotent who watches over such a precious life, and manifested the hope that the highest would someday reveal the malefactor, whose crime remained unpunished, thanks to the charity of the victim, who was too closely following the words of the great martyr, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." These and other things Benzabe said in print, while by mouth he was inquiring whether there was any truth in the rumor that the opulent jeweler was going to give a grand fiesta, a banquet such as had never before been seen, in part to celebrate his recovery, and in part as a farewell to the country in which he had increased his fortune. It was whispered as certain that Simão, who would have to leave with the Captain General, whose command expired in May, was making every effort to secure from Madrid an extension 308 and that he was advising His Excellency to start a campaign in order to have an excuse for remaining, but it was further reported that for the first time His Excellency had disregarded the advice of his favorite, making it a point of honor not to retain for a single additional day the power that had been conferred upon him, a rumor which encouraged belief that the fiesta announced would take place very soon. For the rest, Simão remained unfathomable, since he had become very uncommunicative, showed himself seldom, and smiled mysteriously when the rumored fiesta was mentioned. "Come, Señor Sinbad," Benzabe had once rallied him, "dazzle us with something Yankee. You owe something to this country." "Doubtless," was Simão's response, with a dry smile. "You'll throw the house wide open, maybe, but as I have no house. You ought to have secured Capitan Tiago's, which Señor Peles got for nothing." Simão became silent, and from that time on he was often seen in the store of Don Timoteo Peles, with whom it was said he had entered into partnership. Some weeks afterward, in the month of April, it was rumored that Juanito Peles, Don Timoteo's son, was going to marry Paulita Gomez, the girl coveted by Spaniards and foreigners. "Some men are lucky," exclaimed other envious merchants, "to buy a house for nothing. Sell his consignment of galvanized iron well, get into partnership with a Simão, and marry his son to a rich heiress. Just say if those aren't strokes of luck that all honorable men don't have." "If you only knew whence came that luck of Señor Peles's," another responded, in a tone which indicated that the speaker did know. "It's also assured that there'll be a fiesta and on a grand scale," was added with mystery. It was really true that Paulita was going to marry 309 Juanito Peles. Her love for Isagani had gradually waned, like all first loves based on poetry and sentiment. The events of the Pasquinades and the imprisonment of the youth had shorn him of all his charms. To whom would it have occurred to seek danger? To desire to share the fate of his comrades, to surrender himself, when everyone was hiding and denying any complicity in the affair? It was quixotic, it was madness that no sensible person in Manila could pardon, and Juanito was quite right in ridiculing him, representing what a sorry figure he cut when he went to the civil government. Naturally, the brilliant Paulita could no longer love a young man who so erroneously understood social matters and whom all condemned. Then she began to reflect. Juanito was clever, capable, gay, shrewd, the son of a rich merchant of Manila, and a Spanish mestizo besides, if Don Timoteo was to be believed, a full-blooded Spaniard. On the other hand, Isagani was a provincial native who dreamed of forests infested with leeches. He was of doubtful family, with a priest for an uncle, who would perhaps be an enemy to luxury and balls, of which she was very fond. One beautiful morning therefore it occurred to her that she had been a downright fool to prefer him to his rival, and from that time on Pele's hump steadily increased. Unconsciously, yet rigorously, Paulita was obeying the law discovered by Darwin, that the female surrenders herself to the fittest male, to him who knows how to adapt himself to the medium in which he lives, and to live in Manila there was no other like Peles, who from his infancy had had chicanery at his fingertips. Lent passed with its Holy Week, its array of processions and pompous displays, without other novelty than a mysterious mutiny among the artillerymen, the cause of which was never disclosed. The houses of light materials were torn down in the presence of a troop of cavalry, ready to fall upon the owners in case they should offer resistance. There was a great deal of weeping and many lamentations. But the affair did not get beyond that. The curious, among 310 them Simon, went to see those who were left homeless, walking about indifferently, and assuring each other that thenceforward they could sleep in peace. Towards the end of April, all the fears being now forgotten, Manila was engrossed with one topic, the fiesta that Don Timoteo Peles was going to celebrate at the wedding of his son, for which the general had graciously and condescendingly agreed to be the patron. Simon was reported to have arranged the matter. The ceremony would be solemnized 2 days before the departure of the general, who would honor the house and make a present to the bridegroom. It was whispered that the jeweler would pour out cascades of diamonds and throw away handfuls of pearls in honor of his partner's son. Thus, since he could hold no fiesta of his own, as he was a bachelor and had no house, improving the opportunity to dazzle the Filipino people with a memorable farewell. All Manila prepared to be invited, and never did uneasiness take stronger hold of the mind than in view of the thought of not being among those bidden. Friendship with Simon became a matter of dispute, and many husbands were forced by their wives to purchase bars of steel and sheets of galvanized iron in order to make friends with Don Timoteo Peles. 311. Contents. Chapter XXXIII. La Ultima Raison 1. At last the great day arrived. During the morning Simon had not left his house, busied as he was in packing his arms and his jewels. His fabulous wealth was already locked up in the big steel chest with its canvas cover, there remaining only a few cases containing bracelets and pins, doubtless gifts that he meant to make. He was going to leave with the Captain General, who cared in no way to lengthen his stay, fearful of what people would say. Malicious ones insinuated that Simon did not dare remain alone, since without the general's support he did not care to expose himself to the vengeance of the many wretches he had exploited, all the more reason for which was the fact that the general who was coming was reported to be a model of rectitude and might make him disgorge his gains. The superstitious Indians, on the other hand, believed that Simon was the devil who did not wish to separate himself from his prey. The pessimists winked maliciously and said, "The field laid waste, the locust leaves for other parts." Only a few, a very few, smiled and said nothing. In the afternoon Simon had given orders to his servant that if there appeared a young man calling himself Basilio he should be admitted at once. Then he shut himself up in his room and seemed to become lost in deep thought. Since his illness the jeweler's countenance had become harder and gloomier, while the wrinkles between his eyebrows had 312 deepened greatly. He did not hold himself so erect as formerly, and his head was bowed. So absorbed was he in his meditations that he did not hear a knock at the door, and it had to be repeated. He shuddered and called out, "Come in." It was Basilio, but how altered! If the change that had taken place in Simone during those 2 months was great, in the young student it was frightful. His cheeks were hollow, his hair unkempt, his clothing disordered. The tender melancholy had disappeared from his eyes, and in its place glittered a dark light, so that it might be said that he had died and his corpse had revived, horrified with what it had seen in eternity. If not crime, then the shadow of crime had fixed itself upon his whole appearance. Simone himself was startled and felt pity for the wretch. Without any greeting Basilio slowly advanced into the room, and in a voice that made the jeweler shudder said to him, "Señor Simone, I've been a wicked son and a bad brother. I've overlooked the murder of one and the tortures of the other, and God has chastised me. Now there remains to me only one desire, and it is to return evil for evil, crime for crime, violence for violence." Simone listened in silence, while Basilio continued, "4 months ago you talked to me about your plans. I refused to take part in them, but I did wrong, you have been right. 3 months and a half ago the revolution was on the point of breaking out. But I did not then care to participate in it, and the movement failed. In payment for my conduct I've been arrested and owe my liberty to your efforts only. You are right, and now I've come to say to you, put a weapon in my hand and let the revolution come. I am ready to serve you, along with all the rest of the unfortunates." The cloud that had darkened Simone's brow suddenly disappeared, a ray of triumph darted from his eyes, and like one who has found what he sought he exclaimed, "I'm right. Yes, I'm right. Right and justice are on my side, because 313 my cause is that of the persecuted. Thanks, young man, thanks. You've come to clear away my doubts, to end my hesitation." He had risen and his face was beaming. The zeal that had animated him when 4 months before he had explained his plans to Basilio in the wood of his ancestors reappeared in his countenance like a red sunset after a cloudy day. "Yes," he resumed, "the movement failed and many have deserted me because they saw me disheartened and wavering at the supreme moment. I still cherished something in my heart, I was not the master of all my feelings, I still loved. Now everything is dead in me, no longer is there even a corpse sacred enough for me to respect its sleep. No longer will there be any vacillation, for you yourself, an idealistic youth, a gentle dove, understand the necessity and come to spur me to action. Somewhat late. You have opened your eyes, for between you and me together we might have executed marvelous plans, I above in the higher circles spreading death amid perfume and gold, brutalizing the vicious and corrupting or paralyzing the few good, and you below among the people, among the young men, stirring them to life amid blood and tears. Our task, instead of being bloody and barbarous, would have been holy, perfect, artistic, and surely success would have crowned our efforts. But no intelligence would support me. I encountered fear or effeminacy among the enlightened classes, selfishness among the rich, simplicity among the youth, and only in the mountains, in the waste places, among the outcasts, have I found my men. But no matter now. If we can't get a finished statue, rounded out in all its details, of the rough block we work upon, let those to come take charge. Seizing the arm of Basilio, who was listening without comprehending all he said, he led him to the laboratory where he kept his chemical mixtures. Upon the table was placed a large case made of dark shagreen, similar to those 314 that hold the silver plate exchanged as gifts among the rich and powerful. Opening this, Simone revealed to sight, upon a bottom of red satin, a lamp of very peculiar shape. Its body was in the form of a pomegranate as large as a man's head, with fissures in it exposing to view the seeds inside, which were fashioned of enormous carnelians. The covering was of oxidized gold in exact imitation of the wrinkles on the fruit. Simon took it out with great care and, removing the burner, exposed to view the interior of the tank, which was lined with steel 2 centimeters in thickness and which had a capacity of over a liter. Basilio questioned him with his eyes, for as yet he comprehended nothing. Without entering upon explanations, Simon carefully took from a cabinet a flask and showed the young man the formula written upon it. Nitroglycerin, murmured Basilio, stepping backward and instinctively thrusting his hands behind him. Nitroglycerin. Dynamite. Beginning now to understand, he felt his hair stand on end. Yes, nitroglycerin, repeated Simon slowly, with his cold smile and a look of delight at the glass flask. It's also something more than nitroglycerin, it's concentrated tears, repressed hatred, wrongs, injustice, outrage. It's the last resort of the weak. Force against force, violence against violence. A moment ago I was hesitating, but you have come and decided me. This night the most dangerous tyrants will be blown to pieces, the irresponsible rulers that hide themselves behind God and the state, whose abuses remain unpunished because no one can bring them to justice. This night, the Philippines will hear the explosion that will convert into rubbish the formless monument whose decay I have fostered. Basilio was so terrified that his lips worked without producing any sound, his tongue was paralyzed, his throat parched. For the first time he was looking at the powerful liquid which he had heard talked of as a thing distilled 315 in gloom by gloomy men, in open war against society. Now he had it before him, transparent and slightly yellowish, poured with great caution into the artistic pomegranate. Simon looked to him like the genie of the Arabian Nights that sprang from the sea. He took on gigantic proportions, his head touched the sky. He made the house tremble and shook the whole city with a shrug of his shoulders. The pomegranate assumed the form of a colossal sphere, the fissures became hellish grins whence escaped names and glowing cinders. For the first time in his life Basilio was overcome with fright and completely lost his composure. Simon, meanwhile, screwed on solidly a curious and complicated mechanism, put in place a glass chimney, then the bomb, and crowned the whole with an elegant shade. Then he moved away some distance to contemplate the effect, inclining his head now to one side, now to the other, thus better to appreciate its magnificent appearance. Noticing that Basilio was watching him with questioning and suspicious eyes, he said, "Tonight there will be a fiesta and this lamp will be placed in a little dining kiosk that I've had constructed for the purpose. The lamp will give a brilliant light, bright enough to suffice for the illumination of the whole place by itself, but at the end of 20 minutes the light will fade, and then when someone tries to turn up the wick a cap of fulminate of mercury will explode, the pomegranate will blow up and with it the dining room, in the roof and floor of which I have concealed sacks of powder, so that no one shall escape." There was a moment's silence, while Simon stared at his mechanism and Basilio scarcely breathed. "So my assistance is not needed," observed the young man. "No, you have another mission to fulfill," replied Simon thoughtfully. "At 9 the mechanism will have exploded and the report will have been heard in the country round. In the mountains, in the caves. The uprising that I had arranged with the artillerymen was a failure from lack 316 of plan and timeliness, but this time it won't be so. Upon hearing the explosion, the wretched and the oppressed, those who wander about pursued by force, will sally forth armed to join Cape Sangtales in Santa Mesa, whence they will fall upon the city too, while the soldiers, whom I have made to believe that the general is shamming an insurrection in order to remain, will issue from their barracks ready to fire upon whomsoever I may designate. Meanwhile, the cowed populace, thinking that the hour of massacre has come, will rush out prepared to kill or be killed, and as they have neither arms nor organization, you with some others will put yourself at their head and direct them to the warehouses of Quiroga, where I keep my rifles. Cape Sangtales and I will join one another in the city and take possession of it, while you in the suburbs will seize the bridges and throw up barricades, and then be ready to come to our aid to butcher not only those opposing the revolution but also every man who refuses to take up arms and join us. All, stammered Basilio in a choking voice. All, repeated Simon in a sinister tone. All Indians, mestizos, Chinese, Spaniards. All who are found to be without courage, without energy. The race must be renewed. Cowardly fathers will only breed slavish sons, and it wouldn't be worthwhile to destroy and then try to rebuild with rotten materials. What, do you shudder? Do you tremble? Do you fear to scatter death? What is death? What does a hecatomb of 20,000 wretches signify? 20,000 miseries less, and millions of wretches saved from birth. The most timid ruler does not 317 hesitate to dictate a law that produces misery and lingering death for thousands and thousands of prosperous and industrious subjects, happy perchance, merely to satisfy a caprice, a whim, his pride, and yet you shudder because in one night are to be ended forever the mental tortures of many helots, because a vitiated and paralytic people has to die to give place to another, young, active, full of energy. What is death? Nothingness, or a dream? Can its specters be compared to the reality of the agonies of a whole miserable generation? The needful thing is to destroy the evil, to kill the dragon and bathe the new people in the blood, in order to make it strong and invulnerable. What else is the inexorable law of nature, the law of strife, in which the weak has to succumb so that the vitiated species be not perpetuated and creation thus travel backwards? Away then with effeminate scruples. Fulfill the eternal laws, foster them, and then the earth will be so much the more fecund the more it is fertilized with blood, and the thrones the more solid the more they rest upon crimes and corpses. Let there be no hesitation, no doubtings. What is the pain of death? A momentary sensation, perhaps confused, perhaps agreeable, like the transition from waking to sleep. What is it that is being destroyed? Evil, suffering feeble weeds, in order to set in their place luxuriant plants. Do you call that destruction? I should call it creating, producing, nourishing, vivifying. Such bloody sophisms, uttered with conviction and coolness, overwhelmed the youth. Weakened as he was by more than 3 months in prison and blinded by his passion for revenge, so he was not in a mood to analyze the moral basis of the matter. Instead of replying that the worst and cowardliest of men is always something more than a plant, because he has a soul and an intelligence, which, however vitiated and brutalized they may be, can be redeemed, instead of replying that man has no right to dispose of one life for the benefit of another, that the right to life is inherent in every individual like the right to liberty and to 318 light, instead of replying that if it is an abuse on the part of governments to punish in a culprit the faults and crimes to which they have driven him by their own negligence or stupidity, how much more so would it be in a man, however great and however unfortunate he might be, to punish in a wretched people the faults of its governments and its ancestors, instead of declaring that God alone can use such methods, that God can destroy because he can create, God who holds in his hands recompense, eternity, and the future, to justify his acts, and man never, instead of these reflections, Basilio merely interposed a cant reflection. What will the world say at the sight of such butchery? The world will applaud, as usual, conceding the right of the strongest, the most violent, replied Simeon with his cruel smile. Europe applauded when the Western nations sacrificed millions of Indians in America, and not by any means to found nations. Much more moral or more pacific, there is the North with its egotistic liberty, its lynch law, its political frauds, the South with its turbulent republics, its barbarous revolutions, civil wars, pronunciamientos, as in its mother Spain. Europe applauded. When the powerful Portugal despoiled the Moluccas, it applauds while England is destroying the primitive races in the Pacific to make room for its emigrants. Europe will applaud. As the end of a drama, the close of a tragedy, is applauded, for the vulgar do not fix their attention on principles, they look only at results. Commit the crime well, and you will be admired and have more partisans than if you had carried out virtuous actions with modesty and timidity. Exactly, rejoined the youth, what does it matter to me, after all, whether they praise or censure, when this world takes no care of the oppressed, of the poor, and of weak womankind? What obligations have I to recognize toward society when it has recognized none toward me? That's what I like to hear, declared the tempter triumphantly. 319 He took a revolver from a case and gave it to Basilio, saying, at 10 o'clock wait for me in front of the church of Saint Sebastian to receive my final instructions. Ah! At 9 you must be far, very far from Calle and Loag. Basilio examined the weapon, loaded it, and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat, then took his leave with a curt, I'll see you later. 320. One ultima raison de res, the last argument of King's force. Expression attributed to Calderón de la Barca, the great Spanish dramatist. Tr upward arrow. Too curiously enough, and by what must have been more than a mere coincidence, this route through Santa Mesa from San Juan del Monte was the one taken by an armed party in their attempt to enter the city at the outbreak of the Katipunan Rebellion on the morning of August 30, 1896. Foremans the Philippine Islands, Chap XXVI. It was also on the bridge connecting these two places that the first shot in the insurrection against American sovereignty was fired on the night of February 4, 1899. Tr upward arrow. Contents. Chapter 30. The wedding. Once in the street, Basilio began to consider how he might spend the time until the fatal hour arrived, for it was then not later than 7 o'clock. It was the vacation period and all the students were back in their towns, Isagani being the only one who had not cared to leave, but he had disappeared that morning and no one knew his whereabouts, so Basilio had been informed when after leaving the prison he had gone to visit his friend and ask him for lodging. The young man did not know where to go, for he had no money. Nothing but the revolver. The memory of the lamp filled his imagination, the great catastrophe that would occur within 2 hours. Pondering over this, he seemed to see the men who passed before his eyes walking without heads, and he felt a thrill of ferocious joy in telling himself that, hungry and destitute, he that night was going to be dreaded, that from a poor student and servant, perhaps the sun would see him transformed into someone terrible and sinister, standing upon pyramids of corpses, dictating laws to all those who were passing before his gaze now in magnificent carriages. He laughed like one condemned to death and patted the butt of the revolver. The boxes of cartridges were also in his pockets. A question suddenly occurred to him: where would the drama begin? In his bewilderment, he had not thought of asking Simeon, but the latter had warned him to keep away from Calle and Loag. Then came a suspicion. That afternoon, upon leaving the prison, he had proceeded to the former house of Capitan Tiago to get his few personal effects, and had found it transformed, prepared for a fiesta. 321 The wedding of Juanito Pérez. Simón had spoken of a fiesta. At this moment he noticed passing in front of him a long line of carriages filled with ladies and gentlemen, conversing in a lively manner, and he even thought he could make out big bouquets of flowers, but he gave the detail no thought. The carriages were going toward Calle Rosario, and in meeting those that came down off the bridge of Spain had to move along slowly and stop frequently. In one he saw Juanito Pérez at the side of a woman dressed in white with a transparent veil, in whom he recognized Paulita Gomez. Paulita, he ejaculated in surprise, realizing that it was indeed she, in a bridal gown, along with Juanito Pérez, as though they were just coming from the church. Poor Isagani, he murmured, what can have become of him? He thought for a while about his friend, a great and generous soul, and mentally asked himself if it would not be well to tell him about the plan, then answered himself that Isagani would never take part in such a butchery. They had not treated Isagani as they had him. Then he thought that had there been no imprisonment, he would have been betrothed or a husband, at this time, a licentiate in medicine, living and working in some corner of his province. The ghost of Julie, crushed in her fall, crossed his mind, and dark flames of hatred lighted his eyes. Again he caressed the butt of the revolver, regretting that the terrible hour had not yet come. Just then he saw Simón come out of the door of his house, carrying in his hands the case containing the lamp, carefully wrapped up, and enter a carriage, which then followed those bearing the bridal party. In order not to lose track of Simón, Basilio took a good look at the cochero and with astonishment recognized in him the wretch who had driven him to San Diego, Sinang, the fellow maltreated by the civil guard, the same who had come to the prison to tell him about the occurrences in Tiani. 322. Conjecturing that Calle and Loag was to be the scene of action, thither the youth directed his steps, hurrying forward and getting ahead of the carriages, which were, in fact, all moving toward the former house of Capitan Tiago. There they were assembling in search of a ball, but actually to dance in the air. Basilio smiled when he noticed the pairs of civil guards who formed the escort, and from their number he could guess the importance of the fiesta and the guests. The house overflowed with people and poured floods of light from its windows. The entrance was carpeted and strewn with flowers. Upstairs there, perhaps in his former solitary room, an orchestra was playing lively airs, which did not completely drown the confused tumult of talk and laughter. Don Timoteo Pérez was reaching the pinnacle of fortune, and the reality surpassed his dreams. He was, at last, marrying his son to the rich Gomez heiress, and, thanks to the money Simón had lent him, he had royally furnished that big house, purchased for half its value, and was giving in it a splendid fiesta, with the foremost divinities of the Manila Olympus for his guests, to gild him with the light of their prestige. Since that morning there had been recurring to him, with the persistence of a popular song, some vague phrases that he had read in the communion service. Now has the fortunate hour come. Now draws nigh the happy moment. Soon there will be fulfilled in you the admirable words of Simón. I live, and yet not I alone, but the Captain General liveth in me. The Captain General, the patron of his son. True, he had not attended the ceremony, where Don Custodio had represented him, but he would come to dine. He would bring a wedding gift, a lamp which not even Aladdin's between you and me. Simón was presenting the lamp. Timoteo, what more could you desire? The transformation that Capitan Tiago's house had undergone was considerable. It had been richly repapered, while the smoke and the smell of opium had been completely 323 eradicated. The immense sala, widened still more by the colossal mirrors that infinitely multiplied the lights of the chandeliers, was carpeted throughout, for the salons of Europe had carpets, and even though the floor was of wide boards brilliantly polished, a carpet it must have too, since nothing should be lacking. The rich furniture of Capitantiago had disappeared, and in its place was to be seen another kind, in the style of Louis XV. Heavy curtains of red velvet, trimmed with gold, with the initials of the bridal couple worked on them, and upheld by garlands of artificial orange blossoms, hung as portieres and swept the floor with their wide fringes, likewise of gold. In the corners appeared enormous Japanese vases, alternating with those of Sèvres of a clear dark blue, placed upon square pedestals of carved wood. The only decorations not in good taste were the screaming chromos which Don Timoteo had substituted for the old drawings and pictures of saints of Capitantiago. Simone had been unable to dissuade him, for the merchant did not want oil paintings. Some one might ascribe them to Filipino artists. He, a patron of Filipino artists, never on that point depended his peace of mind and perhaps his life, and he knew how to get along in the Philippines. It is true that he had heard foreign painters mentioned Raphael, Murillo, Velázquez, but he did not know their addresses, and then they might prove to be somewhat seditious. With the chromos he ran no risk, as the Filipinos did not make them, they came cheaper, the effect was the same, if not better, the colors brighter, and the execution very fine. Don't say that Don Timoteo did not know how to comport himself in the Philippines. The large hallway was decorated with flowers, having been converted into a dining room, with a long table for 30 persons in the center, and around the sides, pushed against the walls, other smaller ones for 2 or 3 persons each. Bouquets of flowers, pyramids of fruits among ribbons and lights, covered their centers. The groom's place was designated 324 by a bunch of roses, and the bride's by another of orange blossoms and tuberoses. In the presence of so much finery and flowers one could imagine that nymphs in gauzy garments and cupids with iridescent wings were going to serve nectar and ambrosia to aerial guests, to the sound of lyres and Aeolian harps. But the table for the greater gods was not there, being placed yonder in the middle of the wide azotea within a magnificent kiosk constructed especially for the occasion. A lattice of gilded wood over which clambered fragrant vines screened the interior from the eyes of the vulgar without impeding the free circulation of air to preserve the coolness necessary at that season. A raised platform lifted the table above the level of the others at which the ordinary mortals were going to dine, and an arch decorated by the best artists would protect the august heads from the jealous gaze of the stars. On this table were laid only 7 plates. The dishes were of solid silver, the cloth and napkins of the finest linen, the wines the most costly and exquisite. Don Timoteo had sought the most rare and expensive in everything, nor would he have hesitated at crime had he been assured that the Captain General liked to eat human flesh. 325. Contents. Chapter XXXV. The Fiesta. Danzar sobre un volcan. By 7 in the evening the guests had begun to arrive. First, the lesser divinities, petty government officials, clerks, and merchants, with the most ceremonious greetings and the gravest airs at the start, as if they were parvenus, for so much light, so many decorations, and so much glassware had some effect. Afterwards, they began to be more at ease, shaking their fists playfully, with pats on the shoulders, and even familiar slaps on the back. Some, it is true, adopted a rather disdainful air, to let it be seen that they were accustomed to better things. Of course they were. There was one goddess who yawned, for she found everything vulgar, and even remarked that she was ravenously hungry, while another quarreled with her god, threatening to box his ears. Don Timoteo bowed here and bowed there, scattered his best smiles, tightened his belt, stepped backward, turned halfway round, then completely around, and so on again and again, until one goddess could not refrain from remarking to her neighbor, under cover of her fan, "My dear, how important the old man is. Doesn't he look like a jumping jack?" Later came the bridal couple, escorted by Dona Victorina and the rest of the party. Congratulations, handshakings, patronizing pats for the groom, for the bride, insistent stares and anatomical observations on the part of the men, with analyses of her gown, her toilette, speculations as to her health and strength on the part of the women. 326. Cupid and Psyche appearing on Olympus, thought Benzabe, making a mental note of the comparison to spring it at some better opportunity. The groom had in fact the mischievous features of the god of love, and with a little goodwill his hump, which the severity of his frock coat did not altogether conceal, could be taken for a quiver. Don Timoteo began to feel his belt squeezing him, the corns on his feet began to ache. His neck became tired, but still the general had not come. The greater gods, among them Padre Irene and Padre Salvi, had already arrived, it was true, but the chief thunderer was still lacking. The poor man became uneasy, nervous, his heart beat violently. But still he had to bow and smile. He sat down, he arose, failed to hear what was said to him, did not say what he meant. In the meantime, an amateur god made remarks to him about his chromos, criticizing them with the statement that they spoiled the walls. "Spoil the walls," repeated Don Timoteo, with a smile and a desire to choke him. "But they were made in Europe and are the most costly I could get in Manila. Spoil the walls." Don Timoteo swore to himself that on the very next day he would present for payment all the chits that the critic had signed in his store. Whistles resounded, the galloping of horses was heard at last. The general, the captain general, pale with emotion, Don Timoteo, dissembling the pain of his corns and accompanied by his son and some of the greater gods, descended to receive the mighty Jove. The pain at his belt vanished before the doubts that now assailed him. Should he frame a smile or affect gravity, should he extend his hand or wait for the general to offer his carambas? Why had nothing of this occurred to him before, so that he might have consulted his good friend Simon? To conceal his agitation, he whispered to his son in a low, shaky voice, "Have you a speech prepared?" 327. Speeches are no longer in vogue, Papa, especially on such an occasion as this. Jupiter arrived in the company of Juno, who was converted into a tower of artificial lights with diamonds in her hair, diamonds around her neck, on her arms, on her shoulders. She was literally covered with diamonds. She was arrayed in a magnificent silk gown, having a long train decorated with embossed flowers. His Excellency literally took possession of the house, as Don Timoteo stammeringly begged him to do. 1 The orchestra played the royal march while the divine couple majestically ascended the carpeted stairway. Nor was His Excellency's gravity altogether affected. Perhaps for the first time since his arrival in the islands he felt sad, a strain of melancholy tinged his thoughts. This was the last triumph of his 3 years of government, and within 2 days he would descend forever from such an exalted height. What was he leaving behind? His Excellency did not care to turn his head backwards, but preferred to look ahead, to gaze into the future. Although he was carrying away a fortune, large sums to his credit were awaiting him in European banks, and he had residences, yet he had injured many. He had made enemies at the court, the high official was waiting for him there. Other Generals had enriched themselves as rapidly as he, and now they were ruined. Why not stay longer, as Simone had advised him to do? No, good taste before everything else. The bows, moreover, were not now so profound as before. He noticed insistent stares, and even looks of dislike, but still he replied affably and even attempted to smile. "It's plain that the sun is setting," observed Padre Irene in Benzabe's ear. "Many. Now stare him in the face." The devil with the curate, that was just what he was going to remark. 328. "My dear," murmured into the ear of a neighbor the lady who had referred to Don Timoteo. "As a jumping jack, did you ever see such a skirt? Ugh, the curtains from the palace." "You don't say?" "But it's true. They're carrying everything away. You'll see how they make wraps out of the carpets." "That only goes to show that she has talent and taste," observed her husband, reproving her with a look. "Women should be economical." This poor god was still suffering from the dressmaker's bill. "My dear, give me curtains at 12 pesos a yard, and you'll see if I put on these rags," retorted the goddess in pique. "Heavens! You can talk when you have done something fine like that to give you the right." Meanwhile, Basilio stood before the house, lost in the throng of curious spectators, counting those who alighted from their carriages. When he looked upon so many persons, happy and confident, when he saw the bride and groom followed by their train of fresh and innocent little girls, and reflected that they were going to meet their horrible death, he was sorry and felt his hatred waning within him. He wanted to save so many innocents. He thought of notifying the police, but a carriage drove up to set down Padre Salvi and Padre Irene, both beaming with content, and like a passing cloud his good intentions vanished. "What does it matter to me?" he asked himself. "Let the righteous suffer with the sinners." Then he added, to silence his scruples, "I'm not an informer, I mustn't abuse the confidence he has placed in me. I owe him more than I do them. He dug my mother's grave, they killed her. What have I to do with them? I did everything possible to be good and useful, I tried to forgive and forget, I suffered every imposition, and only asked that they leave me in peace. I got in no one's way. What have they done to me? Let their mangled limbs fly through the air. We've suffered enough." 329. Then he saw Simone alight with the terrible lamp in his hands, saw him cross the entrance. With bowed head, as though deep in thought, Basilio felt his heart beat fainter, his feet and hands turn cold, while the black silhouette of the jeweler assumed fantastic shapes enveloped in flames. There at the foot of the stairway Simone checked his steps, as if in doubt, and Basilio held his breath. But the hesitation was transient. Simone raised his head, resolutely ascended the stairway, and disappeared. It then seemed to the student that the house was going to blow up at any moment, and that walls, lamps, guests, roof, windows, orchestra, would be hurtling through the air like a handful of coals in the midst of an infernal explosion. He gazed about him and fancied that he saw corpses in place of idle spectators. He saw them torn to shreds. It seemed to him that the air was filled with flames, but his calmer self triumphed over this transient hallucination, which was due somewhat to his hunger. "Until he comes out, there's no danger," he said to himself. "The Captain General hasn't arrived yet." He tried to appear calm and control the convulsive trembling in his limbs, endeavoring to divert his thoughts to other things. Something within was ridiculing him, saying, "If you tremble now, before the supreme moment, how will you conduct yourself when you see blood flowing, houses burning, and bullets whistling?" His Excellency arrived, but the young man paid no attention to him. He was watching the face of Simon, who was among those that descended to receive him, and he read in that implacable countenance the sentence of death for all those men, so that fresh terror seized upon him. He felt cold, he leaned against the wall, and, with his eyes fixed on the windows and his ears cocked, tried to guess what might be happening. In the sala he saw the crowd surround Simon to look at the lamp, he heard congratulations and exclamations of admiration. The words dining room, novelty, were repeated many times. He saw 330. The general smile and conjectured that the novelty was to be exhibited that very night. By the jeweller's arrangement, on the table whereat His Excellency was to dine, Simon disappeared, followed by a crowd of admirers. At that supreme moment his good angel triumphed, he forgot his hatreds, he forgot Julie, he wanted to save the innocent. Come what might, he would cross the street and try to enter. But Basilio had forgotten that he was miserably dressed. The porter stopped him and accosted him roughly, and finally, upon his insisting, threatened to call the police. Just then Simon came down, slightly pale, and the porter turned from Basilio to salute the jeweler as though he had been a saint passing. Basilio realized from the expression of Simon's face that he was leaving the fated house forever, that the lamp was lighted. Alia jacta est. Seized by the instinct of self-preservation, he thought then of saving himself. It might occur to any of the guests through curiosity to tamper with the wick, and then would come the explosion to overwhelm them all. Still he heard Simon say to the cochero, the escolta, hurry. Terrified, dreading that he might at any moment hear the awful explosion, Basilio hurried as fast as his legs would carry him to get away from the accursed spot, but his legs seemed to lack the necessary agility, his feet slipped on the sidewalk as though they were moving but not advancing. The people he met blocked the way, and before he had gone 20 steps he thought that at least 5 minutes had elapsed. Some distance away he stumbled against a young man who was standing with his head thrown back, gazing fixedly at the house, and in him he recognized Isagani. What are you doing here? He demanded. Come away. Isagani stared at him vaguely, smiled sadly, and again turned his gaze toward the open balconies, across which was revealed the ethereal silhouette of the bride clinging to the groom's arm as they moved slowly out of sight. 331. Come, Isagani, let's get away from that house. Come. Basilio urged in a hoarse voice, catching his friend by the arm. Isagani gently shook himself free and continued to stare with the same sad smile upon his lips. For God's sake, let's get away from here. Why should I go away? Tomorrow it will not be she. There was so much sorrow in those words that Basilio for a moment forgot his own terror. Do you want to die? He demanded. Isagani shrugged his shoulders and continued to gaze toward the house. Basilio again tried to drag him away. Isagani, Isagani, listen to me. Let's not waste any time. That house is mine, it's going to blow up at any moment, by the least imprudent act, the least curiosity. Isagani, all will perish in its ruins. In its ruins, echoed Isagani, as if trying to understand, but without removing his gaze from the window. Yes, in its ruins, yes, Isagani. For God's sake, come. I'll explain afterwards. Come. One who has been more unfortunate than either you or I has doomed them all. Do you see that white, clear light, like an electric lamp, shining from the azotea? It's the light of death. A lamp charged with dynamite, in a mine dining room, will burst. And not a rat will escape alive. Come. No, answered Isagani, shaking his head sadly. I want to stay here, I want to see. Her for the last time. Tomorrow, you see, she will be something different. Let fate have its way. Basilio then exclaimed, hurrying away. Isagani watched his friend rush away with a precipitation that indicated real terror, but continued to stare toward the charmed window, like the Cavalier of Toggenburg, waiting for his sweetheart to appear, as Schiller tells. Now the sala was deserted. All having repaired to the dining rooms, 332, and it occurred to Isagani that Basilio's fears may have been well founded. He recalled the terrified countenance of him who was always so calm and composed, and it set him to thinking. Suddenly an idea appeared clear in his imagination: the house was going to blow up. And Paulita was there, Paulita was going to die a frightful death. In the presence of this idea everything was forgotten: jealousy, suffering, mental torture, and the generous youth thought only of his love. Without reflecting, without hesitation, he ran toward the house, and thanks to his stylish clothes and determined mien, easily secured admittance. While these short scenes were occurring in the street, in the dining kiosk of the greater gods, there was passed from hand to hand a piece of parchment on which were written in red ink these fateful words: many, tickle, fares to Juan Crisostomo Ibarra. Juan Crisostomo Ibarra? Who is he? Asked His Excellency, handing the paper to his neighbor. A joke in very bad taste, exclaimed Don Custodio. To sign the name of a filibuster. Dead more than 10 years. A filibuster. It's a seditious joke. There being ladies present. Padre Irene looked around for the joker and saw Padre Salvi, who was seated at the right of the Countess, turn as white as his napkin, while he stared at the mysterious words with bulging eyes. The scene of the Sphinx recurred to him. What's the matter, Padre Salvi? He asked. Do you recognize your friend's signature? Padre Salvi did not reply. He made an effort to speak 333 and without being conscious of what he was doing wiped his forehead with his napkin. What has happened to your reverence? It is his very handwriting, was the whispered reply in a scarcely perceptible voice. It's the very handwriting of Ibarra. Leaning against the back of his chair, he let his arms fall as though all strength had deserted him. Uneasiness became converted into fright. They all stared at one another without uttering a single word. His Excellency started to rise, but apprehending that such a move would be ascribed to fear, controlled himself and looked about him. There were no soldiers present, even the waiters were unknown to him. Let's go on eating, gentlemen, he exclaimed, and pay no attention to the joke. But his voice, instead of reassuring, increased the general uneasiness, for it trembled. I don't suppose that many, tickle, fares, means that we're to be assassinated tonight, speculated Don Custodio. All remained motionless, but when he added, yet they might poison us, they leaped up from their chairs. The light, meanwhile, had begun slowly to fade. The lamp is going out, observed the general uneasily. Will you turn up the wick, Padre Irene? But at that instant, with the swiftness of a flash of lightning, a figure rushed in, overturning a chair and knocking a servant down, and in the midst of the general surprise, seized the lamp, rushed to the azotea, and threw it into the river. The whole thing happened in a second and the dining kiosk was left in darkness. The lamp had already struck the water before the servants could cry out, thief, thief, and rush toward the azotea. A revolver, cried one of them. A revolver, quick. After the thief. But the figure, more agile than they, had already mounted the balustrade and before a light could be brought, precipitated itself into the river, striking the water with a loud splash. 334. One Spanish etiquette requires a host to welcome his guest with the conventional phrase, The house belongs to you. Tr upward arrow. 2. The handwriting on the wall at Belshazzar's feast, foretelling the destruction of Babylon. Daniel, v. 25, 28 Tr upward arrow. Contents. Chapter 30. Benzab's afflictions. Immediately upon hearing of the incident, after lights had been brought and the scarcely dignified attitudes of the startled gods revealed, Benzab, filled with holy indignation, and with the approval of the press censor secured beforehand, hastened home an entresol, where he lived in a mess with others to write an article that would be the sublimest ever penned under the skies of the Philippines. The Captain General would leave disconsolate if he did not first enjoy his dithyrambs, and this Benzab, in his kindness of heart, could not allow. Hence he sacrificed the dinner and ball, nor did he sleep that night. Sonorous exclamations of horror, of indignation, to fancy that the world was smashing to pieces and the stars, the eternal stars, were clashing together. Then a mysterious introduction, filled with allusions, veiled hints, then an account of the affair, and the final peroration. He multiplied the flourishes and exhausted all his euphemisms. In describing the drooping shoulders and the tardy baptism of Salad His Excellency had received on his Olympian brow, he eulogized the agility with which the general had recovered a vertical position, placing his head where his legs had been, and vice versa, then intoned a hymn to Providence for having so solicitously guarded those sacred bones. The paragraph turned out to be so perfect that His Excellency appeared as a hero, and fell higher, as Victor Hugo said. He wrote, erased, added, and polished, so that, without wanting in veracity, this was his special merit as a 335 journalist. The whole would be an epic, grand for the seven gods, cowardly and base for the unknown thief, who had executed himself, terror-stricken, and in the very act convinced of the enormity of his crime. He explained Padre Irene's act of plunging under the table as an impulse of innate valor, which the habit of a god of peace and gentleness, worn throughout a whole life, had been unable to extinguish, for Padre Irene had tried to hurl himself upon the thief and had taken a straight course along the submensal route. In passing, he spoke of submarine passages, mentioned a project of Don Custodio's, called attention to the liberal education and wide travels of the priest. Padre Salvi's swoon was the excessive sorrow that took possession of the virtuous Franciscan to see the little fruit borne among the Indians by his pious sermons, while the immobility and fright of the other guests, among them the Countess, who sustained Padre Salvi, she grabbed him, were the serenity and sang-froid of heroes, inured to danger in the performance of their duties, beside whom the Roman senators surprised by the Gallic invaders were nervous schoolgirls frightened at painted cockroaches. Afterwards, to form a contrast, the picture of the thief, fear, madness, confusion. The fierce look, the distorted features, and force of moral superiority in the race his religious ought to see assembled there such august personages. Here came inopportunely a long imprecation, a harangue, a diatribe against the perversion of good customs. Hence the necessity of a permanent military tribunal, a declaration of martial law. Within the limits already so declared, special legislation, energetic and repressive. Because it is in every way needful, it is of imperative importance to impress upon the malefactors and criminals that if the heart is generous and paternal for those who are submissive and obedient to the law, the hand is strong, firm, inexorable, hard, and severe for those who against all reason fail to respect it and who insult the sacred institutions of the 336 fatherland. Yes, gentlemen, this is demanded not only for the welfare of these islands, not only for the welfare of all mankind, but also in the name of Spain, the honor of the Spanish name, the prestige of the Iberian people, because before all things else Spaniards we are, and the flag of Spain, etc. He terminated the article with this farewell: "Go in peace, gallant warrior, you who with expert hand have guided the destinies of this country in such calamitous times. Go in peace to breathe the balmy breezes of Manzanares, one we shall remain here like faithful sentinels to venerate your memory, to admire your wise dispositions, to avenge the infamous attempt upon your splendid gift, which we will recover even if we have to dry up the seas. Such a precious relic will be for this country an eternal monument to your splendor, your presence of mind, your gallantry." In this rather confused way he concluded the article, and before dawn sent it to the printing office, of course with the censor's permit. Then he went to sleep like Napoleon, after he had arranged the plan for the Battle of Jena. But at dawn he was awakened to have the sheets of copy returned with a note from the editor saying that His Excellency had positively and severely forbidden any mention of the affair, and had further ordered the denial of any versions and comments that might get abroad, discrediting them as exaggerated rumors. To Benzabe this blow was the murder of a beautiful and sturdy child, born and nurtured with such great pain and fatigue. Where now hurl the Catalanarian pride, the splendid exhibition of warlike crime-avenging materials? And to think that within a month or two he was going to leave the Philippines, and the article could not be published in Spain, since how could he say those things about the criminals of Madrid, where other ideas prevailed, where 337 extenuating circumstances were sought, where facts were weighed, where there were juries, and so on? Articles such as his were like certain poisonous rums that are manufactured in Europe, good enough to be sold among the Negroes, good for Negroes too, with the difference that if the Negroes did not drink them they would not be destroyed. While Benzabe's articles, whether the Filipinos read them or not, had their effect. If only some other crime might be committed today or tomorrow, he mused. With the thought of that child dead before seeing the light, those frozen buds, and feeling his eyes fill with tears, he dressed himself to call upon the editor. But the editor shrugged his shoulders. His Excellency had forbidden it because if it should be divulged that 7 of the greater gods had let themselves be surprised and robbed by a nobody, while they brandished knives and forks, that would endanger the integrity of the fatherland. So he had ordered that no search be made for the lamp or the thief, and had recommended to his successors that they should not run the risk of dining in any private house, without being surrounded by halberdiers and guards, as those who knew anything about the events that night in Don Timoteo's house were for the most part military officials and government employees. It was not difficult to suppress the affair in public, for it concerned the integrity of the fatherland. Before this name Benzabe bowed his head heroically, thinking about Abraham, Guzman el Bueno III, or at least, Brutus and other heroes of antiquity. Such a sacrifice could not remain unrewarded, the gods of journalism being pleased with Abraham Benzabe. Almost upon the hour came the reporting angel bearing the sacrificial lamb in the shape of an assault committed at a country house on the Pasig, where certain friars were 338 spending the heated season. Here was his opportunity, and Benzabe praised his gods. The robbers got over 2,000 pesos, leaving badly wounded 1 friar and 2 servants. The curate defended himself as well as he could behind a chair, which was smashed in his hands. "Wait, wait," said Benzabe, taking notes. 40 or 50 outlaws traitorously revolvers, bolos, shotguns, pistols lying at bay, chair splinters flying barbarously wounded 10,000 pesos. So great was his enthusiasm that he was not content with mere reports, but proceeded in person to the scene of the crime, composing on the road a Homeric description of the fight. A harangue in the mouth of the leader? A scornful defiance on the part of the priest. All the metaphors and similes applied to His Excellency, Padre Irene and Padre Salvi would exactly fit the wounded friar, and the description of the thief would serve for each of the outlaws. The imprecation could be expanded, since he could talk of religion, of the faith, of charity, of the ringing of bells, of what the Indians owed to the friars. He could get sentimental and melt into Castlerian for epigrams and lyric periods. The senoritas of the city would read the article and murmur, "Benzabe, bold as a lion and tender as a lamb." But when he reached the scene, to his great astonishment he learned that the wounded friar was no other than Padre Camorra, sentenced by his provincial to expiate in the pleasant country house on the banks of the Pasig his pranks in Tiani. He had a slight scratch on his hand and a bruise on his head received from flattening himself out on the floor. The robbers numbered 3 or 4, armed only with bolos, the sum stolen 50 pesos. "It won't do," exclaimed Benzabe. "Shut up. You don't know what you're talking about." "How don't I know, Punales?" 339. "Don't be a fool, the robbers must have numbered more. You inkslinger." So they had quite an altercation. What chiefly concerned Benzabe was not to throw away the article, to give importance to the affair, so that he could use the peroration. But a fearful rumor cut short their dispute. The robbers caught had made some important revelations. One of the outlaws under Matanglawan, Cape Sangtales, had made an appointment with them to join his band in Santa Mesa, thence to sack the conventos and houses of the wealthy. They would be guided by a Spaniard, tall and sunburnt, with white hair, who said that he was acting under the orders of the general, whose great friend he was, and they had been further assured that the artillery and various regiments would join them, wherefore they were to entertain no fear at all. The Tulazanes would be pardoned and have a third part of the booty assigned to them. The signal was to have been a cannon shot, but having waited for it in vain, the Tulazanes, thinking themselves deceived, separated, some going back to their homes, some returning to the mountains vowing vengeance on the Spaniard, who had thus failed twice to keep his word. Then they, the robbers caught, had decided to do something on their own account, attacking the country house that they found closest at hand, resolving religiously to give 2/3 of the booty to the Spaniard with white hair, if perchance he should call upon them for it. The description being recognized as that of Simon, the declaration was received as an absurdity and the robber subjected to all kinds of tortures, including the electric machine, for his impious blasphemy. But news of the disappearance of the jeweler having attracted the attention of the whole escolta, and the sacks of powder and great quantities of cartridges having been discovered in his house, the story began to wear an appearance of truth. Mystery began to enwrap the affair, enveloping it in clouds. There 340 were whispered conversations, coughs, suspicious looks, suggestive comments, and trite second-hand remarks. Those who were on the inside were unable to get over their astonishment. They put on long faces, turned pale, and but little was wanting for many persons to lose their minds in realizing certain things that had before passed unnoticed. "We've had a narrow escape." Who would have said? In the afternoon Benzabe, his pockets filled with revolvers and cartridges, went to see Don Custodio, whom he found hard at work over a project against American jewelers. In a hushed voice he whispered between the palms of his hands into the journalist's ear mysterious words. "Really?" questioned Benzabe, slapping his hand on his pocket and paling visibly. Wherever he may be found, the sentence was completed with an expressive pantomime. Don Custodio raised both arms to the height of his face, with the right more bent than the left, turned the palms of his hands toward the floor, closed one eye, and made 2 movements in advance. SSH. SSH, he hissed. And the diamonds, inquired Benzabe. If they find him, he went through another pantomime with the fingers of his right hand, spreading them out and clenching them together like the closing of a fan, clutching out with them somewhat in the manner of the wings of a windmill sweeping imaginary objects toward itself with practiced skill. Benzabe responded with another pantomime, opening his eyes wide, arching his eyebrows and sucking in his breath eagerly as though nutritious air had just been discovered. SSSH. 341. 1. A town in Ciudad Real province, Spain. TR upward arrow. 2. The italicized words are in English in the original. TR upward arrow. 3. A Spanish hero, whose chief exploit was the capture of Gibraltar from the Moors in 1308. TR upward arrow. 4. Emilio Castilla, 1832–1899, generally regarded as the greatest of Spanish orators. TR upward arrow. Contents. Chapter XXXVII. The Mystery. Todo se sabe. Notwithstanding so many precautions, rumors reached the public, even though quite changed and mutilated. On the following night they were the theme of comment in the house of Orenda, a rich jewel merchant in the industrious district of Santa Cruz. And the numerous friends of the family gave attention to nothing else. They were not indulging in cards, or playing the piano, while little Tina, the youngest of the girls, became bored playing conca by herself, without being able to understand the interest awakened by assaults, conspiracies, and sacks of powder, when there were in the 7 holes so many beautiful cowries that seemed to be winking at her in unison and smiled with their tiny mouths half opened, begging to be carried up to the home. Even Isagani, who, when he came, always used to play with her and allow himself to be beautifully cheated, did not come at her call, for Isagani was gloomily and silently listening to something Chichoe the silversmith was relating. Momoe, the betrothed of Sencia, the eldest of the daughters, a pretty and vivacious girl, rather given to joking, had left the window where he was accustomed to spend his evenings in amorous discourse, and this action seemed to be very annoying to the lorry whose cage hung from the eaves there, the lorry endeared to the house from its ability to greet everybody in the morning with marvelous phrases of love. Capitana Lalang, the energetic and intelligent Capitana Lalang, had her account book open before her, but she 342 neither read nor wrote in it, nor was her attention fixed on the trays of loose pearls, nor on the diamonds. She had completely forgotten herself and was all ears. Her husband himself, the great Capitan Toringoy, a transformation of the name Domingo, the happiest man in the district, without other occupation than to dress well, eat, loaf, and gossip, while his whole family worked and toiled, had not gone to join his coterie, but was listening between fear and emotion to the hair-raising news of the lank Chichoe. Nor was reason for all this lacking. Chichoe had gone to deliver some work for Don Timoteo Peles, a pair of earrings for the bride, at the very time when they were tearing down the kiosk that on the previous night had served as a dining room for the foremost officials. Here Chichoe turned pale and his hair stood on end. "Naku," he exclaimed, "sacks and sacks of powder under the floor, in the roof, under the table, under the chairs, everywhere. It's lucky none of the workmen were smoking." "Who put those sacks of powder there?" asked Capitana Lalang, who was brave and did not turn pale, as did the enamored Momoe. But Momoe had attended the wedding, so his posthumous emotion can be appreciated. He had been near the kiosk. "That's what no one can explain," replied Chichoe. "Who would have any interest in breaking up the fiesta? There couldn't have been more than one, as the celebrated lawyer Señor Pasta, who was there on a visit, declared, either an enemy of Don Timoteo's or a rival of Juanito's. The Orenda girls turned instinctively toward Isagani, who smiled silently. Hide yourself, Capitana Laleng advised him. They may accuse you. Hide. Again Isagani smiled but said nothing. Don Timoteo, continued Chichoe, did not know to 343 whom to attribute the deed. He himself superintended the work, he and his friend Simon. And nobody else. The house was thrown into an uproar. The lieutenant of the guard came, and after enjoining secrecy upon everybody, they sent me away. But stammered the trembling Momoe. Naku, ejaculated Sensia, gazing at her fiancé and trembling sympathetically to remember that he had been at the fiesta. This young man, if the house had blown up, she stared at her sweetheart passionately and admired his courage. If it had blown up, no one in the whole of Cayenne Loac would have been left alive, concluded Capitan Turingoy, feigning valor and indifference in the presence of his family. I left in consternation, resumed Chichoe, thinking about how, if a mere spark, a cigarette had fallen, if a lamp had been overturned, at the present moment we should have neither a general, nor an archbishop, nor anyone, not even a government clerk. All who were at the fiesta last night annihilated. Virgin Santissima. This young man. Susmario Sep, exclaimed Capitana Laleng. All our debtors were there, Susmario Sep. And we have a house near there. Who could it have been? Now you may know about it, added Chichoe in a whisper, but you must keep it a secret. This afternoon I met a friend, a clerk in an office, and in talking about the affair, he gave me the clue to the mystery. He had it from some government employees. Who do you suppose put the sacks of powder there? Many shrugged their shoulders, while Capitan Turingoy merely looked askance at Isagani. The friars. Quiroga the Chinaman. Some student. Makarag. 344. Capitan Turingoy coughed and glanced at Isagani, while Chichoe shook his head and smiled. The jeweler Simon. Simon. The profound silence of amazement followed these words. Simon, the evil genius of the Captain General, the rich trader to whose house they had gone to buy unset gems. Simon, who had received the Orenda girls with great courtesy and had paid them fine compliments. For the very reason that the story seemed absurd, it was believed. Credoquia absurdum, said Saint Augustine. But wasn't Simon at the fiesta last night? Asked Sensia. Yes, said Momoe. But now I remember. He left the house just as we were sitting down to the dinner. He went to get his wedding gift. But wasn't he a friend of the general's? Wasn't he a partner of Don Timoteo's? Yes, he made himself a partner in order to strike the blow and kill all the Spaniards. Aha, cried Sensia. Now I understand. What? You didn't want to believe Entente. Simon is the devil and he has bought up the souls of all the Spaniards. Entente said so. Capitana Laleng crossed herself and looked uneasily toward the jewels, fearing to see them turn into live coals, while Capitan Turingoy took off the ring which had come from Simon. Simon has disappeared without leaving any traces, added Chichoe. The civil guard is searching for him. Yes, observed Sensia, crossing herself, searching for the devil. Now many things were explained, Simon's fabulous wealth and the peculiar smell in his house, the smell of sulfur. Bindi, another of the daughters, a frank and lovely girl, remembered having seen blue flames in the 345 jeweler's house one afternoon when she and her mother had gone there to buy jewels. Isagani listened attentively, but said nothing. So, last night ventured Momoe. Last night, echoed Sensia, between curiosity and fear. Momoe hesitated, but the face Sensia put on banished his fear. Last night, while We were eating, there was a disturbance, the light in the general's dining room went out. They say that some unknown person stole the lamp that was presented by Simone. A thief? One of the Black Hand. Isagani arose to walk back and forth. Didn't they catch him? He jumped into the river before anybody recognized him. Some say he was a Spaniard. Some a Chinaman, and others an Indian. It's believed that with the lamp, added Chichoe, he was going to set fire to the house, then the powder. Momoe again shuddered, but noticing that Sensia was watching him tried to control himself. What a pity, he exclaimed with an effort. How wickedly the thief acted. Everybody would have been killed. Sensia stared at him in fright. The women crossed themselves, while Capitan Toringoy, who was afraid of politics, made a move to go away. Momoe turned to Isagani, who observed with an enigmatic smile, "It's always wicked to take what doesn't belong to you." If that thief had known what it was all about, and had been able to reflect, surely he wouldn't have done as he did. Then, after a pause, he added, "For nothing in the world would I want to be in his place." So they continued their comments and conjectures until an hour later, when Isagani bade the family farewell, to return forever to his uncle's side. 346. Contents. Chapter 38. Fatality. Matanglawan was the terror of Luzon. His band had as lief appear in one province where it was least expected as make a descent upon another that was preparing to resist it. It burned a sugar mill in Batangas and destroyed the crops. On the following day it murdered the justice of the peace of Tiani, and on the next took possession of the town of Cavite, carrying off the arms from the town hall. The central provinces, from Tayaba to Pangasinan, suffered from his depredations, and his bloody name extended from Albay in the south to Cagayan in the north. The towns, disarmed through mistrust on the part of a weak government, fell easy prey into his hands at his approach. The fields were abandoned by the farmers, the herds were scattered, while a trail of blood and fire marked his passage. Matanglawan laughed at the severe measures ordered by the government against the Tulas-Ains, since from them only the people in the outlying villages suffered, being captured and maltreated. If they resisted the band, and if they made peace with it, being flogged and deported by the government, provided they completed the journey and did not meet with a fatal accident on the way. Thanks to these terrible alternatives, many of the country folk decided to enlist under his command. As a result of this reign of terror, trade among the towns, already languishing, died out completely. The rich dared not travel, and the poor feared to be arrested by the civil guard, which, being under obligation to pursue the Tulas-Ains, often seized the first person encountered and subjected him to unspeakable tortures. In its impotence, the 347 government put on a show of energy toward the persons whom it suspected, in order that by force of cruelty the people should not realize its weakness. The fear that prompted such measures. A string of these hapless suspects, some 6 or 7, with their arms tied behind them, bound together like a bunch of human meat, was one afternoon marching through the excessive heat along a road that skirted a mountain, escorted by 10 or 12 guards armed with rifles. Their bayonets gleamed in the sun, the barrels of their rifles became hot, and even the sage leaves in their helmets scarcely served to temper the effect of the deadly May sun. Deprived of the use of their arms and pressed close against one another to save rope, the prisoners moved along almost uncovered and unshod, he being the best off, who had a handkerchief twisted around his head. Panting, suffering, covered with dust which perspiration converted into mud, they felt their brains melting, they saw lights dancing before them, red spots floating in the air. Exhaustion and dejection were pictured. In their faces, desperation, wrath, something indescribable, the look of one who dies. Cursing, of a man who is weary of life, who hates himself, who blasphemes against God. The strongest lowered their heads to rub their faces against the dusky backs of those in front of them and thus wipe away the sweat that was blinding them. Many were limping, but if any one of them happened to fall and thus delay the march, he would hear a curse as a soldier ran up brandishing a branch torn from a tree and forced him to rise by striking about in all directions. The string then started to run, dragging, rolling in the dust, the fallen one, who howled and begged to be killed, but perchance he succeeded in getting on his feet and then went along crying like a child and cursing the hour he was born. The human cluster halted at times while the guards drank, and then the prisoners continued on their way with 348 parched mouths, darkened brains, and hearts full of curses. Thirst was for these wretches the least of their troubles. "Move on, you sons of," cried a soldier, again refreshed, hurling the insult common among the lower classes of Filipinos. The branch whistled and fell on any shoulder whatsoever, the nearest one, or at times upon a face to leave a welt at first white, then red, and later dirty with the dust of the road. "Move on, you cowards," at times a voice yelled in Spanish, deepening its tone. "Cowards," repeated the mountain echoes. Then the cowards quickened their pace under a sky of red-hot iron, over a burning road, lashed by the knotty branch which was worn into shreds on their livid skins. A Siberian winter would perhaps be tenderer than the May sun of the Philippines. Yet, among the soldiers there was one who looked with disapproving eyes upon so much wanton cruelty, as he marched along silently with his brows knit in disgust. At length, seeing that the guard, not satisfied with the branch, was kicking the prisoners that fell, he could no longer restrain himself but cried out impatiently, "Here, Motang! Let them alone." Motang turned toward him in surprise. "What's it to you, Carolino?" he asked. "To me, nothing, but it hurts me," replied Carolino. "They're men like ourselves." "It's plain that you're new to the business," retorted Motang with a compassionate smile. "How did you treat the prisoners in the war?" "With more consideration, surely," answered Carolino. Motang remained silent for a moment and then, apparently having discovered the reason, calmly rejoined, "Ah, it's because they are enemies and fight us, while these are our own countrymen." Then drawing nearer to Carolino he whispered, "How 349 stupid you are. They're treated so in order that they may attempt to resist or to escape, and then bang." Carolino made no reply. One of the prisoners then begged that they let him stop for a moment. "This is a dangerous place," answered the corporal, gazing uneasily toward the mountain. "Move on. Move on," echoed Motang and his lash whistled. The prisoner twisted himself around to stare at him with reproachful eyes. "You are more cruel than the Spaniard himself," he said. Motang replied with more blows, when suddenly a bullet whistled, followed by a loud report. Motang dropped his rifle, uttered an oath, and clutching at his breast with both hands fell spinning into a heap. The prisoner saw him writhing in the dust with blood spurting from his mouth. "Halt!" called the corporal, suddenly turning pale. The soldiers stopped and stared about them. A wisp of smoke rose from a thicket on the height above. Another bullet sang to its accompanying report and the corporal, wounded in the thigh, doubled over vomiting curses. The column was attacked by men hidden among the rocks above. Sullen with rage the corporal motioned toward the string of prisoners and laconically ordered, "Fire!" The wretches fell upon their knees, filled with consternation. As they could not lift their hands, they begged for mercy by kissing the dust or bowing their heads. One talked of his children, another of his mother who would be left unprotected, one promised money, another called upon God, but the muzzles were quickly lowered and a hideous volley silenced them all. Then began the sharp shooting against those who were behind the rocks above, over which a light cloud of smoke began to hover. To judge from the scarcity of their shots, the invisible enemies could not have more than 3 rifles. As they advanced firing, the guards sought cover behind 350 tree trunks or crouched down as they attempted to scale the height. Splintered rocks leaped up, broken twigs fell from trees, patches of earth were torn up, and the first guard who attempted the ascent rolled back with a bullet through his shoulder. The hidden enemy had the advantage of position, but the valiant guards, who did not know how to flee, were on the point of retiring, for they had paused, unwilling to advance. That fight against the invisible unnerved them. Smoke and rocks alone could be seen, not a voice was heard, not a shadow appeared, they seemed to be fighting with the mountain. "Shoot, Carolino! What are you aiming at?" called the corporal. At that instant a man appeared upon a rock, making signs with his rifle. "Shoot him," ordered the corporal with a foul oath. 3 guards obeyed the order, but the man continued standing there, calling out at the top of his voice something unintelligible. Carolino paused, thinking that he recognized something familiar about that figure, which stood out plainly in the sunlight. But the corporal threatened to tie him up if he did not fire, so Carolino took aim and the report of his rifle was heard. The man on the rock spun around and disappeared with a cry that left Carolino horror-stricken. Then followed a rustling in the bushes, indicating that those within were scattering in all directions, so the soldiers boldly advanced, now that there was no more resistance. Another man appeared upon the rock, waving a spear, and they fired at him. He sank down slowly, catching at the branch of a tree, but with another volley fell face downwards on the rock. The guards climbed on nimbly, with bayonets fixed ready for a hand-to-hand fight. Carolino alone moved forward reluctantly, with a wandering, gloomy look, the cry of the man struck by his bullet still ringing in his ears. The 351 first to reach the spot found an old man dying, stretched out on the rock. He plunged his bayonet into the body, but the old man did not even wink, his eyes being fixed on Carolino with an indescribable gaze, while with his bony hand he pointed to something behind the rock. The soldiers turned to see Caroline frightfully pale, his mouth hanging open, with a look in which glimmered the last spark of reason, for Carolino, who was no other than Tino, Cape Sangtail's son, and who had just returned from the Carolines, recognized in the dying man his grandfather, Tandang Selo. No longer able to speak, the old man's dying eyes uttered a whole poem of grief, and then a corpse, he still continued to point to something behind the rock. 352. Contents. Chapter 36. Conclusion. In his solitary retreat on the shore of the sea, whose mobile surface was visible through the open windows, extending outward until it mingled with the horizon, Padre Florentino was relieving the monotony by playing on his harmonium sad and melancholy tunes, to which the sonorous roar of the surf and the sighing of the tree-tops of the neighboring wood served as accompaniments. Notes long, full, mournful as a prayer, yet still vigorous, escaped from the old instrument. Padre Florentino, who was an accomplished musician, was improvising, and, as he was alone, gave free rein to the sadness in his heart. For the truth was that the old man was very sad. His good friend, Don Tiburcio de Espadana, had just left him, fleeing from the persecution of his wife. That morning, he had received a note from the lieutenant of the civil guard, which ran thus: My dear chaplain, I have just received from the commandant a telegram that says, Spaniard. Hidden house Padre Florentino capture forward alive dead. As the telegram is quite explicit, warn your friend not to be there when I come to arrest him at 8 tonight. Affectionately. Pores. Burn this note. T. That V. Victorina. Don Tiburcio had stammered. S. She capable of having me. S. Shot. Padre Florentino was unable to reassure him. Vainly he pointed out to him that the word Kojura should have read Kogura 1 and that the hidden Spaniard could not be Don 353 Tiburcio, but the jeweler Simão, who 2 days before had arrived, wounded, and a fugitive, begging for shelter. But Don Tiburcio would not be convinced Kojura was his own lameness, his personal description, and it was an intrigue of Victorina's. To get him back alive or dead, as Isagani had written from Manila. So the poor Ulysses had left the priest's house to conceal himself in the hut of a woodcutter. No doubt was entertained by Padre Florentino that the Spaniard wanted was the jeweler. Simão, who had arrived mysteriously, himself carrying the jewel chest, bleeding, morose, and exhausted. With the free and cordial Filipino hospitality, the priest had taken him in, without asking indiscreet questions, and as news of the events in Manila had not yet reached his ears, he was unable to understand the situation clearly. The only conjecture that occurred to him was that the general, the jeweler's friend and protector, being gone, probably his enemies, the victims of wrong and abuse, were now arising and calling for vengeance, and that the acting governor was pursuing him to make him disgorge the wealth he had accumulated, hence his flight. But whence came his wounds? Had he tried to commit suicide? Were they the result of personal revenge? Or were they merely caused by an accident, as Simão claimed? Had they been received in escaping from the force that was pursuing him? This last conjecture was the one that seemed to have the greatest appearance of probability. Being further strengthened by the telegram received and Simão's decided unwillingness from the start to be treated by the doctor from the capital, the jeweler submitted only to the ministrations of Don Tiburcio, and even to them with marked distrust. In this situation Padre Florentino was asking himself what 354 line of conduct he should pursue when the civil guard came to arrest Simão. His condition would not permit his removal, much less a long journey, but the telegram said alive or dead. Padre Florentine ceased playing and approached the window to gaze out at the sea, whose desolate surface was without a ship, without a sail. It gave him no suggestion. A solitary islet outlined in the distance spoke only of solitude and made the space more lonely. Infinity is at times despairingly mute. The old man was trying to analyze the sad and ironical smile with which Simão had received the news that he was to be arrested. What did that smile mean? And that other smile, still sadder and more ironical, with which he received the news that they would not come before 8 at night? What did all this mystery signify? Why did Simão refuse to hide? There came into his mind the celebrated saying of Saint John Chrysostom, when he was defending the eunuch Eutropius, "Never was a better time than this to say vanity of vanities, and all is vanity." Yes, that Simão, so rich, so powerful, so feared a week ago, and now more unfortunate than Eutropius, was seeking refuge, not at the altars of a church, but in the miserable house of a poor native priest, hidden in the forest, on the solitary seashore. Vanity of vanities, and all is vanity. That man would within a few hours be a prisoner, dragged from the bed where he lay, without respect for his condition, without consideration for his wounds. Dead or alive, his enemies demanded him. How could he save him? Where could he find the moving accents of the Bishop of Constantinople? What weight would his weak words have, the words of a native priest, whose own humiliation this same Simão had in his better days seemed to applaud and encourage. But Padre Florentine no longer recalled the indifferent reception that 2 months before the jeweler had accorded to him when he had tried to interest him in favor of Isagani, 355, then a prisoner on account of his imprudent chivalry. He forgot the activity Simão had displayed in urging Paulita's marriage, which had plunged Isagani into the fearful misanthropy that was worrying his uncle. He forgot all these things and thought only of the sick man's plight and his own obligations as a host, until his senses reeled. Where must he hide him to avoid his falling into the clutches of the authorities? But the person chiefly concerned was not worrying, he was smiling. While he was pondering over these things, the old man was approached by a servant, who said that the sick man wished to speak with him, so he went into the next room. A clean and well-ventilated apartment with a floor of wide boards smoothed and polished, and simply furnished with big, heavy armchairs of ancient design, without varnish or paint. At one end there was a large Kamagon bed with its 4 posts to support the canopy, and beside it a table covered with bottles, lint, and bandages. A praying desk at the feet of a Christ and a scanty library led to the suspicion that it was the priest's own bedroom, given up to his guest according to the Filipino custom of offering to the stranger the best table, the best room, and the best bed in the house. Upon seeing the windows opened wide to admit freely the healthful sea breeze and the echoes of its eternal lament, no one in the Philippines would have said that a sick person was to be found there, since it is the custom to close all the windows and stop up all the cracks just as soon as anyone catches a cold or gets an insignificant headache. Padre Florentine looked toward the bed and was astonished to see that the sick man's face had lost its tranquil and ironical expression. Hidden grief seemed to knit his brows, anxiety was depicted in his looks, his lips were curled in a smile of pain. "Are you suffering, Señor Simão?" asked the priest solicitously, going to his side. "Some. But in a little while I shall cease to suffer," he replied with a shake of his head. 356. Padre Florentine clasped his hands in fright, suspecting that he understood the terrible truth. "My God, what have you done? What have you taken?" He reached toward the bottles. "It's useless now. There's no remedy at all," answered Simão with a pained smile. "What did you expect me to do? Before the clock strikes 8, alive or dead? Dead. Yes, but alive, no. My God, what have you done?" "Be calm," urged the sick man with a wave of his hand. "What's done is done. I must not fall into anybody's hands. My secret would be torn from me. Don't get excited. Don't lose your head, it's useless. Listen, the night is coming on and there's no time to be lost. I must tell you my secret, and entrust to you my last request. I must lay my life open before you. At the supreme moment I want to lighten myself of a load. I want to clear up a doubt of mine. You who believe so firmly in God, I want you to tell me if there is a God. But an antidote, Señor Simão. I have ether, chloroform." The priest began to search for a flask, until Simão cried impatiently, "Useless. It's useless. Don't waste time. I'll go away with my secret." The bewildered priest fell down at his desk and prayed at the feet of the Christ, hiding his face in his hands. Then he arose serious and grave, as if he had received from his God all the force, all the dignity, all the authority of the judge of consciences. Moving a chair to the head of the bed, he prepared to listen. At the first word Simão murmured, when he told his real name, the old priest started back and gazed at him in terror, whereat the sick man smiled bitterly, taken by surprise. The priest was not master of himself, but he soon recovered, and covering his face with the handkerchief again bent over to listen. Simão related his sorrowful story, how, 13 years 357 before, he had returned from Europe filled with hopes and smiling illusions, having come back to marry a girl whom he loved, disposed to do good and forgive all who had wronged him, just so they would let him live in peace. But it was not so. A mysterious hand involved him in the confusion of an uprising planned by his enemies. Name, fortune, love, future, liberty, all were lost, and he escaped only through the heroism of a friend. Then he swore vengeance. With the wealth of his family, which had been buried in a wood, he had fled, had gone to foreign lands and engaged in trade. He took part in the war in Cuba, aiding first one side and then another, but always profiting. There he made the acquaintance of the general, then a major, whose goodwill he won. First by loans of money, and afterwards he made a friend of him by the knowledge of criminal secrets. With his money he had been able to secure the general's appointment. And, once in the Philippines, he had used him as a blind tool and incited him to all kinds of injustice, availing himself of his insatiable lust for gold. The confession was long and tedious, but during the whole of it the confessor made no further sign of surprise and rarely interrupted the sick man. It was night when Padre Florentino, wiping the perspiration from his face, arose and began to meditate. Mysterious darkness flooded the room, so that the moonbeams entering through the window filled it with vague lights and vaporous reflections. Into the midst of the silence the priest's voice broke sad and deliberate, but consoling. God will forgive you, Señor Simón, he said. He knows that we are fallible, he has seen that you have suffered, and in ordaining that the chastisement for your faults should come as death from the very ones you have instigated to crime, we can see his infinite mercy. He has frustrated your plans one by one, the best conceived, first by the death of Maria Clara, then by a lack of preparation, then in some mysterious way. Let us bow to his will and render him thanks. 358. According to you, then, feebly responded the sick man, his will is that these islands should continue in the condition in which they suffer, finished the priest, seeing that the other hesitated. I don't know, sir, I can't read the thought of the inscrutable. I know that he has not abandoned those peoples who in their supreme moments have trusted in him and made him the judge of their cause. I know that his arm has never failed. When, justice long trampled upon and every recourse gone, the oppressed have taken up the sword to fight for home and wife and children, for their inalienable rights, which, as the German poet says, shine ever there above, unextinguished and inextinguishable, like the eternal stars themselves. No, God is justice, he cannot abandon his cause. The cause of liberty, without which no justice is possible. Why then has he denied me his aid? Asked the sick man in a voice charged with bitter complaint. Because you chose means that he could not sanction, was the severe reply. The glory of saving a country is not for him who has contributed to its ruin. You have believed that what crime and iniquity have defiled and deformed, another crime and another iniquity can purify and redeem. Wrong. Hate never produces anything but monsters and crime criminals. Love alone realizes wonderful works, virtue alone can save. No, if our country has ever to be free, it will not be through vice and crime, it will not be so by corrupting its sons, deceiving some and bribing others, no. Redemption presupposes virtue, virtue sacrifice, and sacrifice love. Well, I accept your explanation, rejoined the sick man, after a pause. I have been mistaken, but, because I have been mistaken, will that God deny liberty to a people, and yet save many who are much worse criminals than I am? What is my mistake compared to the crimes of our rulers? Why has that God to give more heed to my iniquity than to the cries of so many innocents? Why has he not stricken me down and then made the people triumph? Why 359 does he let so many worthy and just ones suffer and look complacently upon their tortures? The just and the worthy must suffer in order that their ideas may be known and extended. You must shake or shatter the vase to spread its perfume, you must smite the rock to get the spark. There is something providential in the persecutions of tyrants. Señor Simón. I knew it, murmured the sick man, and therefore I encouraged the tyranny. Yes, my friend, but more corrupt influences than anything else were spread. You fostered the social rottenness without sowing an idea. From this fermentation of vices loathing alone could spring, and if anything were born overnight it would be at best a mushroom. For mushrooms only can spring spontaneously from filth. True it is that the vices of the government are fatal to it, they cause its death, but they kill also the society in whose bosom they are developed. An immoral government presupposes a demoralized people, a conscienceless administration, greedy and servile citizens in the settled parts, outlaws and brigands in the mountains. Like master, like slave. Like government. Like country. A brief pause ensued, broken at length by the sick man's voice. Then, what can be done? Suffer and work. Suffer work, echoed the sick man bitterly. Ah, it's easy to say that, when you are not suffering, when the work is rewarded. If your God demands such great sacrifices from man, man who can scarcely count upon the present and doubts the future,